You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. Now, sometimes, I told you, this guest you have not heard on this show before, but are we lucky? Larry Diamond is a scholar of democracy, and so far as I understand them, and I hope to get a better grasp today, I'm persuaded that his ideas are as illuminating as they are necessary to the moment we find ourselves in. He comes to his views, not only from the study of our country. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and holds a senior fellow in global democracy position at the Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He chairs the Hoover Institution project in Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region, and he's the principal investigator in the Global Digital Policy Incubator, part of Stanford's Cyber Policy Center. And I guess in his spare time, he directs the Center on Democracy and Development and the Rule of Law and leads its program on Arab reform and democracy. Side comment for those of you who think academics don't work hard, just think again. Apart from that, he's also an author, and his books over more than a decade now have been warning us that our democracy needs strengthening. I'm honored to be joined by Professor Larry Diamond. Larry, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
I am a fan of your work and grateful that you're able to share your thoughts with all of us. We are coming up on a terrible anniversary, and I guess we'll circle back and talk a lot about January 6th, maybe towards the end of this conversation. But I think it'd be more informative if we start with a bigger lens, if that's okay.
As you wish.
You said that the peak of the sort of global democratic movement was around the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2005, and that we've been in an era of democratic backsliding since then, and that ours is actually more of an age now of authoritarian populism. Chavez, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Modi come to mind. Can you give us a quick overview of sort of the march forwards and now the march backwards?
Well, the march forward was what many of your listeners will recall was an extraordinary period beginning in the mid-'70s, but accelerating in the '80s and '90s of democratic transitions, democratic victories, democratic progress in the world, with transitions to democracy throughout Central and Eastern Europe, in East Asia, the Philippines, Korea, Taiwan, Latin America, the end of military dictatorships throughout Latin America. It's all very inspiring. But it kind of wound down at the end of the 1990s and really ground to largely a halt or an equilibrium with as you said, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine being really one of the last big victories for democracy. And since 2006, in every year, more countries have declined in freedom than have gained by the assessment of Freedom House. And you've had a lot of countries like Hungary, Turkey, for a time, Poland, for a time, the Philippines, kind of moving backwards away from democracy and into a word I think you aptly used, authoritarian populism. And a lot of authoritarian regimes, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, becoming much more authoritarian and abusive of human rights and threatening to their neighbors. So it's not hopeless, Edwin. I would, highlight that we had a lot of elections in this past year, and many of them were victories for democracy. The authoritarian populist ruler in India, Narendra Modi, he didn't lose power, but he did have setbacks. The same for President Erdogan in Turkey in their local elections there last March. And in a variety of countries, including several in Africa, South Africa, Senegal, Ghana, the ruling parties either lost power or they lost seats in the national legislature as a warning sign that people were not happy with their performance. There was the first alternation of power ever in this small, continuously democratic country in Africa, Botswana. And so it's a mixed picture. There were signs of progress as well. But, of course, then the United States.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Just before we move off the elections that happened this year, I'm a city guy. I'm a Chicagoan. I love big cities. I love them for all kinds of reasons, but their energy and their creativity is part of that reason. I think, am I right, that the losses that the autocratic folks, I don't know, they weren't losses, but the challenges that they had in Turkey and other places came out of the votes of cities and mayors in particular.
So that's certainly true. The opposition won I think the seven largest cities in Turkey in the municipal elections last year. They had already controlled a few, like the capital, Ankara, and the biggest city, Istanbul, but they expanded their control. And the mayor of Budapest, is in opposition, is a sincere, democratically committed politician. You see this pattern in a number of countries. In India, the opposition controls the capital city of New Delhi, and the authoritarian-minded government of Prime Minister Modi has really victimized its the head of the government in the state of New Delhi, and is trying to prosecute him. So you see a lot of this, but there is a big divide across both highly industrialized or post-industrial countries and even developing countries, where the cities tend to be more progressive and in some ways, yes, more committed to democracy, and the countryside is more concerned with tradition and somewhat more responsive to some of these nationalist, hyper-nationalist, and authoritarian populist appeals. And really two of the biggest and most pervasive organizing divides in democratic politics around the world are between city and countryside, or city and kind of exurban suburbs, and between the college and the non-college educated.
Yeah, I guess that just makes me a little bit more worried about the United States, because of the structure of our governing and our politics gives extra weight to folks who aren't in cities. I mean, it downplays the power of cities and the people in them. So I worry about that. We
can explain why that's the case if you want to go into it.
Sure, let's do it.
I mean, think about how electoral districts are drawn. It's not only deliberate gerrymandering. The more progressive voters are packed very tightly in urban constituencies. So Democrats may win these seats with 70 or 80% of the vote, and their vote isn't spread efficiently across geographic districts of wider expanse. And this is one reason why cities tend to lose out, even if you have relatively objective drawing of electoral district boundaries, and then the voters that are maybe more conservative, traditional, and rural are more spread out, and they tend to gain even from a natural process of districting. Sure. And then, of course, we have the more rural states, because of the nature of the U.S. Senate and the Electoral College being vastly overrepresented in the U.S. system.
Yeah, it's dangerous. You read you wrote and I read a terrific piece in the Journal of Democracy in April, and let me just read part of it because I want to talk about it. You wrote, democracies must generate economic prosperity and opportunity while containing corruption, crime, and abuses of power to reinvigorate support for democracy across regions and generations. Liberal democracies can't be weak or retreat. They must exert their power to safeguard free and fair elections, independent media, and the rule of law. I read that and I gasped, I'm afraid, because that's a very high bar. And I want to understand it a little better. And I think you might be able to help me do that. But I also want to know whether autocracies have anything like a similarly high threshold they have to retain, clear to retain power.
Well, the bar is not as high for autocracies in one sense because they can use repression and authoritarian surveillance to beat back or preempt popular dissatisfaction. But they can't necessarily do it absolutely and forever. And long-term sustained corruption and malperformance does accumulate in authoritarian regimes and render them vulnerable. And before we get to the democracies, let's balance our concern with the clear-eyed appreciation of the plight that many authoritarian regimes are in. Venezuela, you've had 8 million people, a quarter of the population, leave the country because of the corruption and economic mismanagement. Turkey, people are very dissatisfied with the corruption, crony capitalism, and hyperinflation after 20 years of rule by President Erdogan's party, the Justice and Development Party. And in Hungary, the economy has been turning down because of the corruption. And Russia is a basket case because it's thrown all its resources into war making and is suffering massive losses. So I think and Iran, look at the economy of Iran and the periodic eruption of protest in Iran because people are so upset with the economic mismanagement, the physical isolation of the country, and again, staggering levels of corruption and self-dealing. So these authoritarian regimes, they do have a certain life cycle, and I think many of them are extremely vulnerable now. The saving grace of democracies is, yes, people get frustrated, people get angry, people get disappointed, but elections do provide a mechanism for renewal. The caveats there are, number one, you need to maintain truly free and fair elections, a relatively fair and level playing field. And number two, you have to hope that in a democracy, if people get disillusioned and turn to an alternative, the alternative is not the one that Elon Musk endorsed for Germany, namely the semi-neo-Nazi Alternative for Germany, the right-wing, extreme right-wing political party. And you have to hope that even softer, illiberal populist versions of that don't get a toehold, because then they not only govern in a very illiberal way, but they proceed to trash the norms, the institutions, the rules, the foundations of democracy itself.
Yeah, here I was thinking you were going to talk about the other guy Elon Musk endorsed for all the same reasons, but we don't have to go there just yet. This notion of what a democracy has to do to stay in power, I'm going to read a quote from FDR, and my listeners have heard me, some of my favorites. It's from 1938, and I think about what was going on in 1938 around the world. It was an authoritarian moment for sure. And he said, I venture the challenging statement that if American democracy ceases to move forward as a living force seeking day and night by peaceful means to better the lot of our citizens, fascism will grow in strength in our land. And I think about that because it's entirely about one of your themes, and that is what makes a government legitimate. And I guess it's also an acknowledgement that legitimacy is a kind of power.
Yeah, absolutely. Legitimacy is an extremely important source of political power, of the authority to govern and make things happen. And it's an indispensable foundation for democracy because democracies are unique in minimizing their reliance on coercion in order to sustain themselves. They really depend on voluntary compliance. And if people don't believe that the system of government that's in place, not the particular government, but the system of government, the constitutional order, is morally right and proper, the best form of government for the country, why would they comply? They would seek to overturn it. They would seek to violate the rules and challenge it either violently, as they did on January 6th, or at least abuse the rules if they conquer power. And so legitimacy in the sense of belief in the moral rightness of the constitutional order, the democratic constitutional order, and commitment to it, as those House members swore an allegiance to yesterday on the House floor, not to Mike Johnson, not to Donald Trump, not to the Republican Party, not to the any political ideology, but to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's what our system depends on.
Yeah, it sure does. I wrestle a lot with this, and I could use your help. I teach a course at DePaul on American democracy, and we take a deep dive into Ohio, where gerrymandering has led to decline in public outcomes and one corruption scandal and another. In that case, the GOP, the party in power, used its power to change the rules, not always in ways that benefit the public, but to stay in power. And I live in Illinois, where God knows Democrats have made similar, much less lately, but when I grew up in Richard J. Daley's Chicago, they did the same kinds of things. And there are plenty of folks like me who worry about the legitimacy of our Supreme Court right now. So how do democracy advocates talk about the problems that threaten legitimacy of institutions like the Supreme Court in the United States without contributing to that autocratic, I don't know, shibboleth that the whole place needs to be torn down?
Yeah, that's a very astute and timely question. I think that it's important not to make it too personal and too partisan, to stick to principles. Part of the reason why we're in this downward spiral of political opportunism and maximalism, the felt need to win by any means necessary, is because of the severe degree of partisan polarization and the sense that, if the other party wins, if the other guy wins, it will somehow be the end. So whenever we can find common ground with people we disagree with, and with members of a different political party or different political ideology, I think it's important to do so to reduce the temperature in our politics and the descent into an all-or-nothing, winner-take-all mentality that if you lose, you lose everything, and if you win, you should take advantage of it to win everything and entrench yourself in power permanently. And I think sticking to principles rather than just saying, oh, the Supreme Court, they're all appointed by Trump, they're just a bunch of Trump loyalists, it's not a productive way to frame it. Let's stick to principles and identify the ways in which their reasoning is flawed and inconsistent with the Constitution and our democratic principles.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think that's a better approach. We've got to reduce the political temperature.
I don't know how, and I want to, again, keep to this topic because it's so important. I think back on the election that was just run, and the Harris campaign campaigned with Republicans, not just Liz Cheney, but lots of Republicans all over the country. The Democratic convention here in Chicago featured Republican speakers, lots of them. In Congress, when Democrats and Republicans negotiate an agreement, whether it's on funding the government or on immigration, in a bipartisan way, one party says, we're going to throw out our speaker because of that, and we're not, and we are walking away from our agreement. So I don't know how you turn down. I guess my concern is that both parties haven't radicalized. The Democratic Party is kind of recognizable and hasn't changed that much in 40 years. The Republican Party's unrecognizable from 10 years ago. It is radicalized so fast. So I don't know how to turn down the temperature when the folks who you would work with in the Republican Party get thrown out of the party for working with Democrats.
Well, we got close on immigration with Democrats working with one of the most conservative Republican senators, but a very principled and patriotic man, James Lankford of Oklahoma. And then we might as well be explicit. It was one man and one man alone who tanked that deal, Donald Trump, because he didn't want a bipartisan immigration bill stealing his issue during the election. I think there will be another opportunity for some kind of bipartisan agreement on immigration. There will have to be, or we can't solve the problem. But it doesn't mean you can't confront the extremism of Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans. It just means when you can find common ground, you should seek it. And you kind of have to build governing coalitions, not necessarily from the exact central point on the political spectrum out, but from somewhere in a broad range of the center out in each direction. And for now, because the country is so divided, I think that's the only way we're going to get the kind of legislation we need. But at the same time, look, I have called out Trump, his authoritarianism, his cynicism, his extremism, quite explicitly. I think it's a threat to democracy, and I am very worried about what has happened to the Republican Party. This is why I am so passionately in favor of nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting, the Alaska model, so that, Donald Trump can't say to a compromise-seeking senator or Congress member, you better stick with me and spurn the Democrats, or I'm going to primary you. Our politics have become so sick that primary has become a verb. I'm going to primary you. Yep. I'll defeat you in a primary for your moderation and, instinct for democratic compromise. And many of these people want to do the right thing, but they don't want to commit political suicide. Yeah. Lisa Murkowski is able to be the most compromise-seeking and independent-minded Republican senator, not only because those are her instincts, I think they are, but because the electoral system in Alaska ensures that she can't be denied a place on the ballot in November because of the top four nonpartisan system. The top four candidates in the primary advance to the general election, and then ranked choice voting is used to choose the winner, and that's how she got reelected in 2022. So if we had that system in more states, I think it would transform our politics.
Yep, I'm a fan. I know Chicago had back in 1987, 80, it was the election before that, 84. The first time Chicago had a black mayor, Harold Washington. And after he won the Democratic primary, a complete unknown Republican nearly beat him because Chicago was, at that time, a different city.
Yeah.
And we changed the rules after that. We just said we're not going to have partisan primaries. We'll have a runoff of the top two candidates, however they get there, and that was an improvement.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah. Let's turn to another topic of yours in that paper, and that's the topic of strength. And you argue that in the face of an authoritarian upswing, democracies can't be weak. And so I'm thinking about that. And you argued that not saying they can't. I'm sorry. The argument was about domestic strength as well as strength around the world. That if you show strength, you are less vulnerable at home. And I think about our last 4 years, because the U.S. in the Biden administration was pretty strong on the international stage, rebuilt alliances, supported Ukraine and others under attack. We pushed back on Russia and on China. And at home, the government prosecuted and jailed the insurrectionists whose miserable anniversary we're going to be remembering in a couple days. But we were weak when it came to holding one particular man accountable for anything. Was that weakness the fatal flaw?
Let me unpack what you said with the following reflections in two parts. Internationally, I think you used the word we were pretty strong. Yeah, we were pretty strong, but we weren't strong enough. We should have given Ukraine everything they needed from the beginning to repel and defeat this Russian invasion, and not yielded to Putin's nuclear blackmail, which I think was an empty threat. And I think that if we had given Ukraine more earlier, it would be in a much stronger position right now. And Russia wouldn't have had the time to build up its arms industry and so on and so forth and get the help it has from China and North Korea. At home, I think there is a gathering, I won't say consensus, but very strong current of opinion that Judge Garland Merrick Garland was not the right choice for Attorney General. That we needed not a partisan Attorney General, but a more vigorous and self-confident Attorney General who wouldn't take 2 years to writhe in indecision about whether to prosecute Trump. And if we had started from the beginning with the principled prosecution that I think the evidence justified, he might have been convicted of something more serious because he certainly seems to have had an instigating role in the January 6th insurrection. And we might not have this kind of authoritarian personality as president of the United States.
Do you think that if I want to put the two together, do you think if we were stronger in supporting Ukraine 4 years ago, that would have changed the domestic calculus here about democracies? Would that in itself
not necessarily. Not necessarily. Right. I think the two actually. It's not that they're unrelated, because they stem from a common spirit of conviction and steely tenacity. But it isn't automatically the case that just because we're as resolute and unwilling to be intimidated as we might have been in Ukraine, that we're going to be the same in confronting criminal acts against democracy within our borders. It's not automatic.
Yeah, and on that Merrick Garland choice, as you were talking, I had this flashback to a scene in, I think it's Godfather 2, where where the Don says, "You're not a wartime consigliere, Tom. You're my lawyer, but this isn't the time for you."
It's a very profound comparison that I have heard made before. Yeah. And these aren't normal times. I do believe that democracy will be under much more serious threat in the second Trump term than it was even at the end of the first.
Yeah, I do too. All right. Well, you've written. No, strike that. I want to go somewhere else first. Our conversation so far has assumed that across, we're going to reach, we can reach across the aisle. We can reach some common ground. Americans can do this. It assumes we share some common sets of facts, but I don't think that's the case anymore. The media's performance in this last few years has shattered that for me. But this brings me to the role of the internet and social media in the democracy, and that's another topic you've thought a lot about. Just talk to us about what we can do to, defend ourselves in some way or mitigate the worst effects.
There are certainly things we can do to identify and isolate and demote. I think that's the word we want to use. In some instances, remove foreign-based propaganda, foreign-based infiltration of our social media, principally from Russia and China, that have the explicit intent of trying to polarize our society and destabilize our democracy. And both the social media companies and U.S. Government monitors have identified a lot of this. And I think we need to be more efficient, more robust, more energetic about identifying this, stigmatizing it, and when it's blatantly false, taking it down. But we enter more difficult territory when we're dealing with content that's domestic generated and has the protection of the First Amendment, and it's just irresponsible. And it really requires the social media companies to change their algorithms so they're not artificially inflating and elevating wildly false, outrageous, conspiratorial content simply because they think it'll make them more money to fan these flames.
Well, I have to stop you there because I know that as you say that, you're thinking that, but that's who bought Twitter, right, and turned it into X, and has demoted, to use your word, common sense in order to be a platform for nonsense.
Yeah, I know. It's very depressing. And it's very, very dangerous. I don't have an obvious answer of what to do about it, except that I think that there is a strong case to be made for removing Section 230 intermediary liability protection from the social media companies, that they should have to be responsible in the way that your radio station and the local newspaper is responsible for the content that they convey. And if they convey knowingly convey false information, or they're carrying false information and destructively false information that they don't do anything to correct, they should be held liable.
They should be liable.
For it.
Absolutely right. To go back to the foreign one. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't see how to motivate them except to address that. There was a very good bill that was introduced a few years ago that, because, having to do this and to kind of monitor your content for minimal standards of accuracy can be extremely expensive. And it can impose an impossible burden on new social media startups that are trying to enter the game. And there was a very intelligent bill that was introduced a few years ago that would only suspend Section 230 liability for the more established big companies with users over a certain number, so that it wouldn't become an impediment to competitiveness in the industry.
That's smart. Well, I guess right now, the only thing we Americans can rely on is that Europe, with different laws, will act in a way that discourages some of this behavior. But it's very tough. Now, what do you think of the question of TikTok? It's we're expecting
TikTok absolutely should be banned in the U.S.
Yeah.
China either is capturing all this data or certainly has the ability to do so. And China can seed the platform with manipulative and subversive content at some point in the future, even if it hasn't done so. The notion that there is such a thing as a fully private company in China that's immune from government intervention and manipulation is simply absurd. I think TikTok is a manifest threat to our national security, and I strongly favor banning it. And if Trump lifts the ban or seeks to undo it, and then comes out and says, well, I'm tough on China, that kind of hypocrisy has to be challenged.
Yeah. Well, he did file a brief with the court saying, don't do it. So, Yep. All right. So you've also written that the cause of freedom in the world is indivisible. And I'm not sure I understood what you meant. I mean, critics might say that kind of thinking has given the U.S. license to act, in ways that we're not really proud of. And some of them have not been good for democracy, like ousting Allende and Mossadegh in our history. Were, sort of, or maybe those are examples where the government violated this very principle. I don't know.
I think they were. Now, look, Allende, he was a socialist at a minimum with Marxists in his circle. So
no question.
I don't want to minimize his own kind of polarizing tendencies. But our support for that coup was a massive mistake, and I think a violation of the principle of trying to uphold freedom and democracy, and led to 16 years of horrific military dictatorship in Chile. And but I think what people worry about more is something like the Iraq invasion, that we could get carried away and invade a country in order to try and promote democracy. And my answer is that I don't think military force is the way to do it. This is why we have various non-governmental instruments, both purely privately funded and publicly funded, including the National Endowment for Democracy and some of the assistance programs of U.S. Agency for International Development and U.S. global media and so on, so that we can counter authoritarian propaganda around the world and support people in these countries or in exile working with people in these countries, in China and Russia and Iran and North Korea and Syria, and now Assad is toppled, and elsewhere, who are struggling to bring democracy. But, you know, our authoritarian adversaries fear the success, the model, the inspiration of democracy. And they will always be trying to find ways to discredit it and destabilize it. So that is the sense in which I think we are in a global contest, and we should, not only for moral reasons, but for the security of our own democracy, care about trying to advance and support freedom around the world.
Yeah, yeah. What would it mean? I mean, we're getting towards the end of our time, I think we could do this for another hour. I could do it for another hour. You're just fascinating. What would it mean for our democracy? What does it mean for the challenge of the next 4 years if on day one Donald Trump pardons the January 6th insurrectionists?
Well, it will be horrible as a precedent, as a message that it's okay to try and overthrow a legitimate electoral outcome. It's okay to use violence in order to try and achieve your undemocratic will, and that the rules, the laws, the Constitution, the physical institution of the Congress, and the safety and even the lives of individual members of Congress and the Vice President of the United States don't matter in the quest for power. The message of that is absolutely terrifying. And the contempt for the rule of law, I think, will do widespread and lasting damage. But there's more than that. There are a lot of people out there who sympathize with Donald Trump and his movement, the MAGA movement. Many of them are organized into extremist groups. They're well armed. They are ready to kind of answer his call and to both return the people who committed these crimes to, free society with no criminal record that's still standing and no legacy of having done wrong in the eyes of the law because of the pardon. And then to kind of give them a positive embrace, a positive celebration, a positive elevation is, I think, in practical terms, extremely dangerous. I've just finished reading a 20-year-old book that a lot of people have been reading recently by Robert Paxton called The Anatomy of Fascism. And I have really restrained myself from using the F word, fascism, in connection with Trump, because it's just seen as a kind of reflexive, derogation.
That's right.
or cuss word or something against somebody you don't like. You call them a fascist. But one of the really defining features of fascism, of a fascist leader and a fascist party, is the use, the stimulation, the mobilization of violent squads of extremists to intimidate opposition, intimidate officials, and do the will of the authoritarian leader. And if Trump seeks to utilize and mobilize these violent extremist right-wing groups, I think it will be an extremely worrisome sign about the direction in which we're headed.
Yep. Okay. We have about a minute, not even. And so I just want to see if I have this right, because I think you've also talked about how autocrats lose. And let's at least end there. Unite the opposition. However you find them, unite them, come together, bridge and transcend the polarizing rhetoric coming from the other side. For gosh sakes, don't always talk about the democracy, because most people actually don't care. Talk about the quality of life that you can get, and be concrete, confident, strong, vigorous, visionary, and don't let them steal the flag. Are those do I have that right?
I think you have it quite right. That is generally the formula. But I'd just like to expand on the issue of what you talk about. You have to appeal to issues that people care about. And most often they are economic issues, how people are doing. And I think that's one of the big reasons why the Democrats lost. It's not like people were hungering for a return of Trump and his authoritarian hand, but they thought their lives were better under Trump materially, economically, and would be again. I think their memory is flawed, but, nevertheless,
some of that goes back to the internet problems you talked about.
And they really felt the pain of inflation. And so the economy, immigration, and some of these cultural issues where the average voter perceived excess on the part of many Democrats. People need to be, people who want to defend democracy need to be sensitive to the other issues people care about.
Yep, totally right. Hey, we're out of time. I would love to stay in touch and maybe do this again as we sort of see what happens in the coming months. Your work is fabulous. For those of you listening, you can find Professor Diamond's work sometimes in the Journal for Democracy. And where else can lay people find your work?
Well, I've published 2 articles at the end of last year in Foreign Affairs magazine and on the Foreign Affairs website.
Yep. All right, everybody. And thank you very much. Really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
All right, we're going to take a break for the news, and then we're going to head over to Center for American Progress when we come back.